Hello and welcome to this video on high gravity brewing, the means by which commercial breweries make watered down piss. Consider the volume of beer that's produced by breweries on a given day, for example. It is thousands if not tens of thousands of litres. If this was made using the standard approach of roughly 1 litre of beer wort to 1 litre of drinkable beer, they would be using massive vats to ferment the wash, or wort. This leads us to the commercial solution, a process called high gravity brewing. As the name suggests, it's all related to the gravity or relative concentration of sugars in your beer wort. This is fermented with a large yeast pitch and then later diluted to a more accurate beer alcohol volume. This does have certain upsides and downsides. The upsides are fairly straightforward, simply that you can do more with less, so to say. And of course, you are diluting a product down to something that's barely passable. But more importantly, it means that they can save a lot of money and produce an increased volume of beer. The general benefits are that you reduce the amount of water required initially. That is, water is a very large volume consuming thing, and so by reducing the amount you need at any given stage of the fermentation, you can theoretically use fewer facilities. That means that you can increase production without having to increase the size of the brewery that you're operating in. You don't necessarily need more vats per se. You can use the same number, but with high gravity brewing, you now increase your production. That also lowers the requirements for storage, the number of staff who need to work, and so on. But importantly, because you are processing less wort, you can theoretically maintain a reasonably consistent output. But you also ensure that although you're able to maintain output, that's because you can maintain a relatively stable number of fermentations and then stage them in such a way that you get constant production, and if you don't have production at one given time, you can just dilute what you've already made. You also have to use less energy, you have to clean fewer things, and there's less waste products generated. The implications of being able to dilute the same volume of beer wort to achieve a greater yield should be readily apparent. As said, if you have a finite area to work within, and you can, let's say, take a vat that's producing a straightforward 1-to-1 ratio of beer wort to beer drink, you basically have a bottleneck. You can only ever get 1-to-1 ratios. However, if you go with high gravity, you can suddenly go from 1 to 1.4, 1.5, and even to 1 to 2. So you get a significantly greater yield without having to increase facilities. And since you haven't increased any of the real, let's say, overheads that you can avoid, for example, staff, you basically save yourself money in that respect. Of course, you still need to make up the difference somehow, and the difference is what we're going to get into when we get into high gravity brewing. The general flexibilities in this are that it's not just that you make one beer. You can, in theory, have to use a very crude analogy, a base, and onto this base you add your various aromatics and aromas, along with the various flavors that you want. This allows you to create a single stock beer, and then you add or modify this as you dilute it down to create the flavors that you want. And because you can not only add extracts from things like malt, various kinds of yeast-derived flavors, but also more recently hops, you can pretty much create a profile that perfectly matches with, nearly perfectly matches with any kind of target beer without ever having to specialize necessarily. This has the simple advantage of allowing you to produce from that one stock beer a wide variety of other beers, and you can be very flexible and dynamic in changing between what you need to make. For instance, if you suddenly receive a large order for one particular kind of beer, and you happen to have nothing in the warehouse, you can produce it this way, and because you're mostly able to use what you already have produced and just alter the flavor, suddenly you can meet demand very quickly. This does bring us to the dilution point though, and to a certain extent, the idea of high gravity brewing isn't that much different to, say, brewing with extracts. That is, things like malt extract, for instance. The major distinction is just in scale to start with, but also to a certain extent how much you're diluting the final product. A lot of the time, if you're going to use malt extract, you're likely to be operating fairly close to the capacity of your fermenter, and that's generally the plan. You want to produce a reasonably large batch which is going to occupy the fermenter for a fair time. With high gravity brewing, they take it several steps further, and so while the final volume may be the same, the end result is not, and it's a significant difference between high gravity brewing and extract brewing. Where extract brewing is fairly straightforward, you more or less dissolve your extract of, say, malt into your water, you need a lot more of what it is that you're doing in high gravity brewing, and we mean a lot more. You're adding a lot more malt, a lot more hops, a lot more yeast, and everything is just more. This does have a negative downside though, and the downside is fairly straightforward and explains why a lot of commercial beer tastes like piss. The nature of how it's brewed leads to a relatively poor retention of flavors and aromas, and in some instances even poor head retention, which is an interesting observation. The reasons for this aren't entirely clear, and there are a lot of variables that come into play. For example, it's reasonably well established at this point that certain yeast strains just don't cope very well with high gravity brewing. It's also going to have an effect on things like colour, for instance. Now, you can, as with most breweries, at least at a commercial scale, adjust and account for this in the final product through modifying the end result. But nonetheless, it is an important thing to be aware of. In terms of the dilution itself, we've mentioned you can go in some cases up to a 1:2 ratio, that is 1 part fermented beer to 2 parts water. This is unlikely to be a common occurrence given the negative effects. You'll notice the difference between a basically pure high gravity brewing fermentation product, what you'll taste during a brewery tour for instance, versus what you get out of a can or a bottle. That's why oftentimes you'll find that what you're getting is the most extreme example in terms of commercial beer. That's because, well, bureaucrats and managers get involved and think, well, it still tastes okay and it will sell because nobody knows any better. And so you get piss in a can. But for most people who at least have some idea about beer, they can tell the difference, and even commercial brewers will know that what they're making isn't great. With the commercial brewers in mind, although management probably wants to push dilutions as far as they can, they oftentimes don't try and get too far. A 1:1 ratio is considered fairly extreme in terms of commercial brewery and on a common scale. You're more likely to see it's a 1:0.5, that is 1 part of the beer as it is, to the 0.5 or 50% water. So if you were to take it and split it into even fractions, it would be 33% water, 66% beer, and 1% random stuff. This is the best balance in terms of retaining flavor and other features of beer, and essentially saving cost by watering it down. Even at a homebrew level, somewhere between 10 and 20% is unlikely to have an appreciable effect on the taste and aroma of your beer that anybody who's not a, let's say, connoisseur will be able to tell. And in some cases, even they may not. You may need to rely on very high-tech and very precise measurements to identify the dilution. This doesn't seem like it's much, and it isn't on an individual scale. 10% or 20% of an individual bottle or can is only going to be a few hundred milliliters at most, or a few ounces. But on the scale of a whole brew, that's anywhere up to an extra 5 liters, sometimes more again. And in other cases, you might be getting even more, particularly if you're talking about on a commercial scale where we're getting thousands of liters at a time. Adding 10 to 20% to that 1,000 or so liters means you go from making 1,000 liters to making 1,200 liters, and that can be a fairly big improvement in profit margins. Something to note is that if you are doing this, and particularly if we're looking at high gravity brewing rather than dilution here, there tends to be a degree of instability inherent in doing this. Remember that you are taking what is a naturally immiscible substance, mostly solids, and trying to make them miscible in water with yeast so they can ferment. Now, this is fine in the short term. Simply put, you don't need to worry so much about it because by the time they begin to fall out of suspension, the fermentation's already happened. But if you're doing high gravity brewing, where there's a lot more physical things in it, you have to worry. So you have 6 major areas. The physical things that are in there, the flavors, foam, light, biological activity, and gushing. The first of these, physical flavor and foam, all relate to the quality of the beer. As we mentioned earlier, there are also features that tend to be negatively affected with high gravity brewing. Because of that, you do tend to have a few issues around the retention of aroma, flavor, and, beer head. On top of that, the basics of it, though, do tend to be more stable. That is, although you lose things like, say, some of the more high notes or the more pronounced flavors, the basics remain there. Fundamentally, you have sweet and slightly alcoholic water. The reason for at least the lack of foaming is the nature of the peptides, the polypeptides, essentially the various long chains that are within the foam head itself. Well, they just don't really survive for very long with high gravity brewing, and because they break down, you get poor foam stability. This leads to flat beer and so on very quickly. Then we have issues around your alpha acids, mostly again talking about the hops here, and certain metal ions that again play a major role in flavor and in the aromas that you get, along with various stability within it. We won't touch much on gushing, just understand that it's a consideration, but we will go into some more detail on the biological activity and particularly of yeast shortly. What we want to talk about is some of the products that are going to be generated during fermentation before we go into that. And we've already touched on the fact that the various polypeptide chains are lost during fermentation when we talk about high gravity brewing, especially by comparison to a standard gravity brew. The other concern with it is, you're going to lose things like esters. You tend to get a negative effect on ester production. And because of this, you tend to get, certain alterations in flavor, as esters tend to be pretty damn useful in some ways. To be clear, you don't want them in excess, because that leads to bad tasting beer, but you just don't get that with high gravity brewing. What instead happens is that the use of malts particularly leads to a lower level of ester production, mostly looking at things like ethyl acetate and isoamyl acetate, at least when you compare this to things like a pure glucose. And because of that, you get, obviously, fewer esters, and this leads to negative effects on the beer flavor, and to a certain extent, stability. The other issue here is that you could theoretically adjust for this if you were to use high maltose syrups, and that would compensate somewhat for this, but that's generally not done as much. In other flavor and aroma developments around it, hop flavors and aromas are particularly negatively affected. The first reason is that they tend to follow a fairly linear scaling model. That is, if you increase the unit of hops by 1, you'll get an increase in the number of hop aromas and flavors by 1. It's always that reasonably straight line. But this has to be adjusted for in one key aspect, the boiling stage. During boiling, you tend to see a significant loss of alpha acids. These are the bittering compounds in hops. Because high gravity brewing tends to rely on much longer term boiling stages, this is one reason why hops should be added as late as possible to compensate for it. Next we go on to the yeast, and we've touched on some of the issues around yeast, particularly metabolism leading to esters, but a major thing here is that you're producing a surprisingly large amount of alcohol, and that large amount of alcohol is going to limit your choice of yeast. Some yeast simply will not survive very well in high gravity brewing environments. There's just too much alcohol, too much of the wort and too rich in sugar that they can't survive. This is where alcohol tolerant yeasts are almost absolutely necessary. If you don't rely on these, you're unlikely to see the kind of yields you're hoping for. The simple reality is that if you want to bring your beer down to, say, 5% alcohol or thereabouts, you're going to need to make sure that the overall fermentation produces something around 7 to 8% alcohol. Since that's roughly twice what you're hoping to get, or thereabouts, you're going to have to try and find a yeast that can tolerate high alcohol, otherwise it will not work. This is one reason why using highly flocculent strains of yeast is bad. They just don't remain in solution long enough to ferment all of the necessary sugars to achieve what you need. One, let's say, proposed solution, and it is viable in some respects, is to use champagne yeast. Now, you can do this simply because of how champagne yeast works and the fact that it is a relatively high alcohol tolerant strain. The problem is it will produce notable champagne-like results in your beer, which obviously isn't ideal. You can instead rely more on more modern strains of various beer strains that are high alcohol tolerant. This is not to say that you can't use champagne yeast, just be aware that, well, it won't necessarily look the best, as one of the other features of champagne yeast is that it isn't very flocculent and it really doesn't come out of suspension very well, and because of that, you'll always have a certain amount of haze in your beer. Something that is done for high gravity brewing is aeration, and this is again relating to the fact that you need to support the yeast as much as possible, and aeration does just that. And finally, as we mentioned earlier on, you need to pitch a lot of yeast. The reality is, you may be looking at twice the typical amount, if not more again. And of course, we're looking at high alcohol tolerant varieties, and so you need to look at how to make the yeast survive as long as possible and work as well as possible, because it will eventually fall out and simply stop working. Mostly again owing to the high alcohol content of the pre-diluted beer. The flavor challenge in beer is the big thing, especially when we talk about high gravity beer here. Because of what you're doing, you initially start with a very sugar-rich base, and you can to a certain extent just try and scale up a recipe, but that only works to a certain extent before you hit the capacity of your fermenter, and then you need to fall back on high gravity brewing. And that's a big challenge here. At that point, you have a lot more sugar in a lot smaller volume, and so the way yeast will utilize various sugars, the various flavors that are to be produced and so on, are all out of sort. Theoretically, they should all be the same ratio, but given the different nature of how yeast will ferment, different reactions, extraction of different flavor compounds within the sugars, grains, etc., you'll find that you don't really get the same ratios you would be hoping for. As a result, you need to balance the flavor much better and much more carefully with high gravity brewing. While we won't go into the great depth on how to balance it, as there are so many varieties of beer and so many variations on different beer styles that it would be impractical, just be aware that if you are going to do this, and it's not unreasonable to think you might, you need to be aware of the challenge in trying to balance everything. For a commercial brewery, it's fine. It's how they go and produce more beer with fewer facilities, time, people, and so on. But for the average home brewer, it's really only a way to get a slightly greater yield with only a slightly smaller dilution. Admittedly, as we said, 10 to 20% may be perfectly viable, or you may wish to stick to a pure beer with no dilution whatsoever. It's entirely up to you. But commercial breweries certainly like this as a practice, because it makes them more money, and amongst all the other benefits we've described. But it also leads to notable downsides we've also described. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.